So I've hit Infinite every single season in Marvel Snap so far, and that dates back to before the global release as well. So I think we're like talking about maybe 10 seasons or something so far where I've hit Infinite. And that whole time I've been thinking I really need to make a video collecting some of my tips and thoughts about the Infinite climb and try to pass on what little knowledge I have gathered. And it's finally here. I've done it. This is a video that's going to help give you some tips and tricks and thoughts on an Infinite grind of your own, because I think you can do this. If you haven't done it before, it's possible. You know, I'm not the world's best card game player. I have some history, I have some experience, sure, but I'm not a tryhard. I'm not some super competitive guy. And I've managed to do it every single month, and I think you can too. So I've put together this. Let's be honest. It's a PowerPoint presentation showcasing. I think I've got 25 different tips here across a few different categories. I've got straight up gameplay tips. I've got some process tips, kind of preparing yourself to hit Infinite, and some mental tips as well, because I think this one is really, really important. So we're going to run through all of these different tips. I'm sorry the presentation here is not perfect, but hopefully the utility and value of this video makes up for it, especially if you're somebody who hasn't hit Infinite before and you need a little edge, you need something to think about, something to chew on. I'm hopeful this video helps. So let's kick it off with some gameplay tips first and foremost. And the first one I've got is to manipulate priority. We're talking about on reveal priority here, which, quick recap, because some people still ask about this. The person who's leading in the game has priority. If it's tied, it's a 50-50 split, but that's always indicated via the glow around the profile picture name. So you can always see who has reveal priority in a given game. But a lot of people, I think, are aware of that, and they're paying attention to it, and they're like, oh man, my opponent's revealing first. I can't do this given thing. But I don't know how many people go to that next level where they begin to manipulate the priority in particular. Because if you play Marvel Snap, a lot of decks have a little bit of control over whether or not they're going to take priority. So for instance, if you're playing a 2-drop into a 3-drop in the early game, are you putting those in 2 different locations, or are you putting them in 1 location? If you're putting them in 1 location, it's less likely you're going to have priority, because your opponent might be able to win the other 2 locations with fairly small power commitments. But if you're spreading your stats out, you're more likely to be winning 2 locations. And in particular, you can try to swing power. Your opponent played something for 2 here, so I'm going to play a Sentinel here for 3 and try to gain a priority advantage and sort of maintain that priority advantage throughout the course of the game. And that's particularly important because sometimes you're going to want to have different priorities. If you're playing big threats that you don't want to be Shang-Chi'd at the end of the game, then you might want to make sure you're passing priority to them so that their Shang-Chi reveals first, and then you drop your giant threat. Or, of course, vice versa. If you're playing a more reactive deck, perhaps you want your opponent to be revealing first to ensure that you're going to be able to respond reactively with Shang-Chi. And some decks will just very naturally play towards this. Like if you're playing a reactive deck, you may not be putting as much power in play early, but you still have to be careful. For instance, I've been playing a Sarah control deck, and it still has early game plays. It has like Sentinels and Lizards and stuff. And if I start spreading those out across the board too much, I may end up in a situation where I have priority when I don't want it. Whereas instead, what I could perhaps do is just stack 3 straight cards all in 1 location to reduce the chances that I'm going to have priority moving into the mid to late game. So, this is going to be deck dependent. It's going to be context dependent on matchups, but it's just something to start paying attention to. Can I maybe isolate some stats? Can I play for like a Baxter building? Because Baxter building is a great way to just instantly gain priority. And you're going to make sure you're covering all 3 lanes with a card like Baxter building. Vice versa, sometimes with the Nexus, if you commit too early, you might have priority when you don't want it. So you'll start to notice certain locations and play alignments that allow you to manipulate this instead of just react to it. And I can't explain to you how your deck is going to need to utilize this, but it's just something to note. Start paying attention to it. Look for opportunities where you say, hey man, wait, if I'd played this card left instead of right, I would have had a better priority situation going into that final turn, which would have allowed me to do the thing that I want to do. So just really being particularly mindful of this. I feel like when I know what my deck's priority goals are, I start to master the deck and feel a lot more comfortable with it and steal wins perhaps that I otherwise wouldn't. Next up is to trust your opponent's win condition. So Marvel Snap is interesting compared to a lot of card games because you only have 12 card decks, and throughout the course of the game, you draw a vast majority of them. You draw 9 cards throughout the game. So any given time, you're wondering if your opponent is going to have a given win condition card, especially, on turn 6, for instance, after all cards have been drawn, there's a really good chance they're gonna have it. So if, you're waiting to see, did they have that spectrum or not? They probably do more often than not. Now, if you can beat a spectrum, that might be worth sticking it out and saying, hey, I've still got a pretty good chance to beat their spectrum, even if they do have it. But if their win condition is like a guaranteed win for them, if the Ultron's gonna beat you, if the spectrum's gonna beat you, that means you probably need to trust it, and you probably need to retreat into those final turn scenarios. Obviously, there can be other context clues to pick up throughout the course of a game if they're playing for something or not. That can guide you a little bit, give you some additional nuance here, but on average, you should expect your opponent to have the thing that's going to win them the game, if it is decisively going to win them the game, and I think respect that. So this next one is to learn from your opponent's snaps, and sometimes even I would say from their gaps. What I mean by that is depending on how long they take to process a turn, or how quickly they perhaps process a turn, you can really start to build an idea of what's going on in their deck and in their head. Super obvious example, obviously, if they played an Electro and they have an empty location on turn 5 and they snap, that's gonna be a Galactus deck, right? You can expect Galactus to come down. Perhaps you can arrow it away to your advantage, but that's the most obvious example. But there's a lot of other scenarios that'll pop up for you as well, where you start to realize, okay, look, they're snapping right now. Why are they snapping going into turn 4? Oh, they have Shuri. They're going to be playing Shuri on turn 4. That's why they're confidently snapping. Can I beat a Shuri deck? Like if there's a big Red Skull coming down, am I going to be able to beat that? If they rely on She-Hulk Taskmaster, can I arrow that away on the final turn? Do I have the answers to the plays that this snap indicates? And in some ways that's really obvious, but I don't think people really pay attention to it that much. They kind of just say it. I think a lot of people look at their own hand and go, okay, my hand's pretty good, I'll play out this snap, as opposed to, it's not just about making a decision on whether or not you're going to play out the game. It's gaining actual in-game information from these snaps. So it's not just this binary yes or no, am I going to continue? It's wait, what can I learn from this? How can I gain an edge from this? Oh, okay, I know they're going to play Shuri. I'm going to do this thing to disrupt that. I'm going to Cosmo this lane, whatever example you want. But you got to basically take it to that next level and start thinking about what that means, not just whether or not you're going to keep going. This next one is don't quit for Shadow King. And what that means is don't retreat games for cards your opponent's not gonna have. And I bring this one up because this happens on stream all the time, where people will say, well, what if they have blank? And what if they have blank? And what if they have blank? And it's like, yeah, those cards are possible to have. My opponent could have the Shadow King answer, but it's not likely. And as you learn deck lists, something we'll talk about later, as you become familiar with what your opponent's decks are likely to do, as you understand card packages and clusters of cards, you'll start to say, hey, no, Shadow King's not that likely, and you'll start to say, hey, wait a minute, actually, I have seen Dr. Doom being included in some Shuri decks lately, so maybe I need to be aware of Dr. Doom, but I haven't seen, Ultron in a Shuri deck. Like, Ultron doesn't make any sense. I don't need to play around Ultron, for instance, but maybe I need to consider Dr. Doom. And just having an awareness of what's likely to be encountered is going to make a big deal, because all the time on stream, people are coming up with the most outlandish ways for a play to get countered, and it's like, no, guys, I can't respect that play. I'm going to respect the things that are likely to be seen, of course, but not the craziness. So don't talk yourself out of games otherwise. It's kind of a way to put that you're probably going to win. So this next one is to map out your opponent's deck. And that really just means to think ahead, not only about what your plays are going to be in the future, but what your opponents are going to be as well. And I gave a really basic example here, but if they're playing an armor or a Cosmo, for instance, in the early game, that might mean a Red Skull is going to go down in that location. So, for instance, if you see an armor go down on turn 2, are you going to commit 10, 12 power to a location to contest in that armor location? Well, no, probably not, because Red Skull's going to go down there because they're trying to set up a location to protect their big Shuried Red Skull. So I'm just going to give up that armor location and perhaps play for one of these other two. Maybe lock one down and Shang-Chi the other one, or just get big enough to win one of these. So, as you start to map out where they're likely to play their cards, you can start to edge out some additional advantages, basically saying, look, I'm not going to overcommit. They're basically signaling how they're going to unfold their deck and their plays, and I can use that to my advantage. So not every deck's going to make that super obvious, but there are some examples you'll pick up from time to time where it's like, okay, I see this. There's a Patriot going down and a Mystique. Maybe this is going to be an Ultron lane, right? And then you start to say, okay, well, that's an Ultron lane. Then they're going to have 4 drones here. Their drones are going to be, maybe 20 power or whatever. And if I can get to 21 power here, I'm good. And if I can beat this Ultron location, that's often a weak location too. So you start to map things out, and you'll just find that the math becomes favorable for you then. This one's something I have to remind myself pretty often. No surprise, no cubes. And I like this tagline here. You're going for 8 with a Chavez. That might be a problem. In other words, you perhaps don't want to be in cube advanced higher stakes games if you don't have something that is surprising or gonna catch your opponent off guard. If you're playing something really typical or predictable, you probably don't belong in that higher stakes game, because your opponent is expecting the predictable and obvious stuff, and they've made a decision to snap and or stay in that higher stakes game based on that information. So if your deck's not running some surprise card, if you don't have some big power swing like a Killmonger or a Shang-Chi, something that's going to create a flip or a dramatic change in the game state, it's probably just best to retreat. Sometimes I catch myself saying, it's like, oh yeah, this could be fine. Like, yeah, it's possible this play wins. I'm adding a few power here and a few power here. That's all right. And I just get hopeful, and I'm perhaps a little bit greedy for cubes, but in reality, I have no business being in those games because I'm not doing something big. I'm not doing something surprising, and I'm probably going to end up with -8 cubes. So this next tip is to place your power with intent. As I wrote here, I know you're just going left to right, and that's exactly what I find myself doing. So this is a tip for me, I think, as much as anybody, which I guess a lot of the tips in this video are. I'll notice sometimes I'm just kind of playing cards in order, particularly with location reveals early, which, that can be fine, just making sure you're playing safely to a revealed location in the early game. But I don't think I'm always thinking about where a card is going and why, and I think you need to. It's really important. This does harken back a little bit to the priority conversation we had before. That can be a reason to place cards with intent, but there can be other reasons as well, right? An example I ran into yesterday, for instance, is like, okay, I've got Onslaught Citadel. This is going to give my Dark Hawk an enormous boost in power, right? Dark Hawk should single-handedly carry the Onslaught Citadel, but at the same time, I found myself playing a Sentinel in Onslaught Citadel, and I was like, wait, why did I put that 3 power in Onslaught Citadel? I don't need that 3 power there. That's not doing anything. I just put it there because it was the first revealed location. But a vast majority of the time, I'm probably going to be better off putting that Sentinel somewhere else, playing for, a second location, adding up, 2 or 3 smaller cards in that location, trying to win it, and then just using Darkhawk to win the Onslaught Citadel single-handedly, right? So perhaps not the best example, I don't know, but the idea is to really think about, like, wait, I'm winning this location with this card, I'm doing this here, I'm going to be arrowing in this location, so maybe I don't need any extra power in this particular location. And if you start to think and map out your given turns, 2, 3, 4 turns ahead throughout the entire game ahead, what am I going to be doing on turn 6? Then you can really place power with intent and start to edge out little tiny advantages. It's like, okay, that extra 2 power here actually made a difference. I could have wasted that in another location, but I know I don't need that power there because I'm going to be doing this other thing. And as you start to map that out and really think through it, you'll gain those tiny wins that you otherwise wouldn't get. This one is kind of a general philosophy I have a little bit in Marvel Snap, and helps me break down the game a little bit, and that's thinking about power per position, because Marvel Snap is really a game that manages your resources in a couple different ways. Of course, you have energy, but also you have board space limitations, and depending on the deck in particular, that can be really, really important not to commit too low of a power per position if you're looking to contest a given location. In other words, if you put 3 really small cards in one spot, your average PPP is going to be pretty low for that location, and it might be hard for you to win with that remaining spot. And in particular, I like to frame this, in comparison to the opponent. It's like, okay, they played a 2 power card in this location. I can probably play something small there, and I'll maintain a power per position parity, or PPPP, as I like to put it, which can help if you're trying to create friction or force them to commit to locations, or just, again, kind of maintain priority advantages sometimes. All of that's important to kind of help you break down how you're going to see a game unfold. Because all the time I'll see like a Thanos player put 3 stones in one spot, and it's like, well, they've just completely locked themselves out here because their average PPP is going to be so low there. Even if they do play a Blue Marvel or something, it's going to be hard for them to really shore up that spot. So this is a little bit about maintaining, open board spaces, but also just managing your expected power per position in a way that makes sense for your deck. Yeah, if they have a Thanos splash late, maybe they can do that. Add that 11 late in the game or something, or 21 late in the game. Maybe that's fine. Maybe that's just a bait for me, but it's just something to be careful of, because all the time I'll see it and then they don't follow it up with anything good later, and you're like, okay, well, that just made that one a free win for me. So this one's just a good reminder. You can snap, I say this because I find myself falling into a lot of patterns when I'm not really consciously playing Marvel Snap, where I'm not actually ever snapping. I'll play out 4 cube games when my opponent snaps sometimes, but a lot of the time I'm not snapping proactively or consciously. It's really just kind of rolling with the flow and doing what my opponent is doing instead. But that's, of course, losing a huge opportunity to express your advantages in a given game. If you have your power cards, if you have your win conditions, if things are lining up well for you, you should be snapping to take advantage of that, particularly in the early to mid game, not on turn 6 very often, although that can be sensible sometimes too. But I know sometimes I just get in a lull and just kind of play it out, play for a lot of 2 cube games instead of pushing advantages, instead of really recognizing my win conditions. So I think this is just a good reminder to say, hey, look, if you're going to be trying to climb, you need to really find your snapping patterns and concentrate on that and take advantage of it. It is a very useful tool, of course, fundamental, in fact, to climbing. So don't forget you can snap. All right, so now let's move over to process tips. This is kind of like how to prepare yourself for a good climb outside of the gameplay itself. So for instance, find a good deck. Obviously, you want to play a good deck when you're climbing, and a lot of people will try to build their own deck, which is great. And if you can build a great deck that's infinite worthy, that's awesome. A+. I love encouraging that. I think Marvel Snap is better than that for most games, in fact. But if you're just looking to get there and you just want to finish the infinite climb, sometimes turning to a trusted, proven deck list can be really valuable. And I say those 2 words with intent, trusted and proven, because I know this from firsthand experience on YouTube. A lot of people will see a deck on YouTube that is not really meant to be a competitive deck. Like, I'll post a deck video that says, this is a really stupid, fun idea. This is a meme deck. And in the intro, I'll explain how this deck's really bad and you shouldn't play this deck and it's just for fun. And then you'll have people in the comments saying like, hey, I tried to climb with this deck. It sucks. And it's like, yeah, Yeah, I know. I told you that in the title and in the intro and in the description. I've started adding really specific power estimates to deck descriptions now as well, to give people an even extra layer of guidance. So in other words, I think a lot of people aren't really doing the due diligence when it comes to finding a deck. They just see something that looks exciting and just assume that's gonna work, when in reality there's a lot of nuance there. So for instance, like on my channel, if you're looking for a good deck, I'm gonna say it's a good deck. I'm gonna say this is like the best deck according to the data, or this deck is working really well. Like, I'll use actual qualitative descriptions explaining that a deck is powerful as opposed to fun or insane or crazy or a meme. So you have to pay attention and listen to the intros in particular, because that's where I talk about the deck's actual power level and performance. And beyond that, you don't even need to go to YouTube, right? YouTube videos can be helpful. They're hopefully fun to watch, but you should really be going to a data aggregation site. So there are a handful. MarvelSnap.pro is one people have used a lot. Untapped.gg just started posting decks as well, and they're a really proven brand from other games as well. MTG and Hearthstone, I have a lot of familiarity with them. So if you want to find good data and a reliable deck, go somewhere like this, where you can see the deck's cube rate, see the deck's win rate, and use these sort of sources to find good decks. Use YouTube for entertainment and fun decks in particular, because obviously a lot of YouTubers are going to be encouraged to be excited about decks and be biased based on, you know, small sample sizes and so on. I personally try to be very mindful of calling out the difference between a good proven deck and a fun deck. So if you look for my clues, you'll see them, but that may not always be the case across YouTube. But regardless, you need to start with a powerful deck. If you haven't been able to hit infinite so far and you're looking to make that push, might be best to turn away from something you've made and turn towards something with a lot of data behind it. So this one's just a little bit of a reminder to not leave games so fast after they're over. I think it really helps to take a second and pause and look at the game state, especially if it's a loss, but sometimes even for wins as well, and start to look at where you played things, especially cards you played early in the game, much like we've talked about for some of these other tips, and say, okay, on turn 2 I played that lizard left. Is there a reason I played it left? Would it have been better somewhere else? Would that 5 power shifted to a different location have changed this game in some way? Now, obviously, you have to understand that you changing your play means the opponent could have changed their play as well. So there's not always a definitive way to say, hey, if I changed that, I could have won. But it still helps to think about it. With the full context of a game now sitting in front of you, you can start to unfold the turns a little bit in reverse and see how your decisions impacted the game, where that's a little bit harder to do sometimes while playing because you don't have the foresight yet to see what's going to happen. But once everything's unfolded, you can start to unwind it and start to look for little opportunities where you could have done something differently, specifically in consideration of that same matchup in the future. If it's a deck you're going to play a lot, like a Thanos or a Shuri deck, you can start to say, okay, if I'd done this, that might have made their life awkward, or this could have changed their play so that I could have done this. And that's really, really useful. I think people are just so ready to queue up the next game that they don't actually take any time to learn or improve. And yeah, you can get better by playing, but you can also get a lot better by observing and carefully thinking about stuff. I know I'll do this on stream sometimes, and people get so impatient. Start the game, Regis. You gotta get to the next game. I can't go 5 seconds without watching a game. But I know some of my best learning opportunities are doing exactly this, where you pause and think about what just happened. So this is a really important tip, and I do worry people don't do it enough. I think people pick a deck they want to play and they learn the ins and outs of their deck really, really well, but then they don't learn other decks in Marvel Snap. And that's kind of natural based on the economy of the game. Obviously, you're not going to be able to play all of the decks. For most people, they're going to have to pick one and roll with it. And that's fine, but you can still learn the decks in other ways. For instance, you can go watch a YouTube video to see how a deck plays and see what the player is thinking about. You can just go and study deck lists and say, like, okay, what are the kind of tech variations of this? I think I mentioned earlier, you know, oh shoot, now Doctor Doom is showing up in Shuri decks sometimes. Okay, that's something I need to pay attention for. and realize. And as you start to accrue this understanding of the meta and the decks that are out there, you'll be much better prepared for what opponents might actually be playing and how to handle these matchups. I think in particular, if you watch someone else pilot a deck, you'll start to understand their pain points and start to understand like how they're going to be thinking about a matchup. I know this is a kind of a backwards example because it's from Hearthstone, but I was in this big show match thing, $100,000 freaking show match thing, and we were preparing, and I prepared with a bunch of Hearthstone Pro players for like a week in preparation. And the very best thing I could do that helped me prepare was playing what my opponents were going to be playing against myself. So in other words, having the context and understanding of this is what their turn one is going to look like. And you start to realize, man, if they do this on turn 3, that's really frustrating for me, and that's really awkward for me. That's a real pain point. That's gonna make me sad. We kept saying, like, man, if you play this on turn 4, that's gonna make me sad. So you realize when that's flipped, oh, I should play this on turn 4 because that's going to make the opponent sad. So having that understanding of what a deck looks like from the other side really builds a lot of extra information and helps you create and produce a lot of friction in those matchups. So hey, we won the tournament, by the way. So it worked for that. And I think it'll work for you on Marvel Snap as well. Just learn what your opponent is thinking about on given turns, and that's going to make you a lot better at fighting against it. So this one is to not change your decks so much. And I think that is 2 different ways to think about that. Number one is changing different deck archetypes. So going from Ultron to Cerebro to Shuri or whatever else, right? But also don't tinker with your deck too much either. I even find myself doing this where I'll have one game that's bad and this card sucked in this game and I'll rip it out. But that's letting variance kind of confuse the situation a little bit, because you're going to have games where certain cards don't work well or things go poorly, but that doesn't mean the deck is doomed or the card is doomed. Sometimes that's just a little bit of bad stretch or bad luck, and putting some faith and investment in a deck, especially if it's one that's proven via data because you found a good deck like we talked about earlier, trust that and just roll with it. You'll start to soften some of those rough edges of the deck and realize these cards are there for a reason because the data is telling us they're there for a reason. So, just do that. And number 2, if you're changing archetypes all the time, you're not going to master a deck. You really want to learn the ins and outs of a deck. You want to learn different matchups. You got to play it. And if you're changing all the time, you're never going to master any given deck. You're going to be playing each deck at 70% efficiency instead of playing one deck at 100% efficiency, and that's definitely going to cost you. So as long as you know your deck is good and the data is there, trust it and don't change it so much. So this next one is to make snapping easier on yourself. I think it's really helpful sometimes to have a rule set for your snapping behavior. Now, as you get really, really advanced, you're obviously going to want more context dependent snapping where you're snapping for specific reasons in specific scenarios. But, when starting out a given deck or just trying to do something consistent, it can help to set rules for yourself. For instance, if I have Lockjaw on turn 3 and the locations don't screw me, I'm going to snap when I have my Lockjaw because that's my win condition. That's going to be powerful. That's my path to victory, so I'm going to snap. If I have Shuri on 4, I'm going to snap because I know that's how I'm going to win the game, right? Setting these really simple rules where you do this every single time, barring, craziness, can really help you understand and just get a better snap kind of hygiene rolling throughout the course of your climb. If nothing else, just making it a good starting point and then using that to learn a little bit like, oh, this actually backfires in these specific scenarios, so don't snap here. That can really help. So, even if you're giving up a few cubes early on in the climb, building that pattern and building that knowledge base for later in the climb probably going to pay off. So just setting some heuristics and setting some rules for your snaps can be helpful. Now, that might be something you determine yourself. That might be something you pick up from a YouTube video or reading a deck guide on Reddit or whatever it is, right? But it definitely can make a difference. All right, so finally we've got the mental tips, and some people I think scoff at this sort of stuff. Like, I want to learn how to play the game very precisely and mechanically, but you need to pay attention to these. Speaking of which, the number one tip is actually pay attention. And that's for both this video, but also for Marvel Snap, of course. I find myself, most of my infinite climb happens when I'm hanging out in bed watching TV with my wife, because that's a lot of free time. We hang out together. So I'm playing Snap, we're watching TV, whatever, you know, bouncing back and forth a little bit. And I notice when I start drifting towards the TV more, obviously I'm going to make a lot more mistakes. And that's not just super obvious stuff like, oh, I didn't see what they discarded, but it's also just like not paying attention to like how quickly or slowly your opponent is playing. If they took 30 seconds to make a decision, what did that mean? That's the stuff you start to miss a little bit when you're not really locked in on a given game, or like not planning out your turns. And you're kind of just bouncing back and forth and just throwing cards really quickly. Obviously that's gonna hurt you. So I find if I really want to seriously climb, I have to either do it like after she's in bed already and I'm just on my phone in the dark playing Marvel Snap, you know, oh boy, or, you know, on my PC, all other stuff closed off, not like bouncing between editing or Chrome or something, but actually paying attention, actually focused. This is a commitment, right? If you want to hit infinite and you haven't done it before, you're going to have to try. You're going to have to make some sacrifices. So setting aside some time to really focus in, I don't think is too much to ask. So this one's always a good rule to make for yourself, to reread locations. Probably honestly every turn, but definitely on turn 5, because I know this is true. You forgot Mindscape. I have had so many games where it is blatantly obvious that the opponent forgot about Mindscape. Well, where they'll do something that, like, you know, they'll leech my hand into Mindscape, and then they have a leeched hand, and then Mindscape goes off, and they instantly retreat. And it's like, guys, you've got to remind yourself what locations do. And I've certainly done the same, right? We're all we're all guilty of this one, I think. So, you know, what happens, I think, a lot of the times is you'll see a location. It's not something that's immediately impactful to you. It's something you have to deal with later. And your brain kind of like segments it off and says, we'll deal with that later, right? Like, this is not a concern right now. This isn't part of my decision making right now. But what happens is you forget to go back to it. You segmented it off and then you never revisit it, right? So you have to, I think, consciously make an effort to reread locations. That happens with cards as well. There's a Cosmo on board. Don't forget about the freaking Cosmo. Refocus in on the both locations and your opponent's cards as well to make sure, or even your own Cosmo for God's sake, to make sure you're not making really fundamental mistakes, because it's really easy to forget stuff. So this is a pretty simple and obvious tip for a lot of strategy games, but when you're tilted, in other words, you're frustrated, the game's not going your way, you're getting angry, take a break. There's no reason to play like that. You don't have to play in one big chunk all at once when you're mad. It's gonna make you play worse. It just happens. You gotta step away from the game a little bit. You'll come back refreshed, you'll feel better, you'll be energized, and you'll play better. Just don't play when you're angry. So this next one, I think, is a really interesting conversation and kind of philosophical, but kind of not. But I hear a lot of people say, oh, Regis, I lost rank. I'm falling backwards. I was 77 and then I dropped to 74. I'm losing progress. I'm falling backwards. I'm going the wrong way, Regis. I'm discouraged. I'm hopeless. I don't even feel like playing anymore. And that negative traction people get can really interrupt their feeling of progress and kind of introduce a lot of rank anxiety and they don't want to play anymore. But I think it's really important to remind people that you're not actually going backwards. And I see the same thing, by the way, from like, oh, I hit 99 and then I fell to 97. I can't get to infinite, Regis. What do? I'm going the wrong way. I'm going to stop playing. But you're not actually losing rank, right? Because in a game like Marvel Snap, you have variance. You have stretches where things are going to go really well. You have stretches where things are going to go poorly. Even if with a 50% win rate, right? If you flip a coin 10 times, sometimes you're going to get 9 games in a row that are heads, and you're going to get 1 game that is tails. That does not mean that you're a 90% tails player who's always losing. Did I switch the heads and tails? You know what I mean. That doesn't mean you're losing 90% of the time. That's just those 10 tosses. That's those 10 games. As you play more and more and more, you're going to find your average. You're going to move closer and closer to that true 50-50, or hopefully if you're ranking up in Marvel Snap, maybe 55, 60% win rate, right? You're going to trend closer to your average as more and more games are introduced. But what you'll see happen is people get tails 9 times in a row and they think, oh my God, I'm awful. I've lost 9 straight games. Things could not possibly be going worse. But then, later on, you're going to get 9 straight heads, right? And on average, you're going to get 6 out of 10 heads and things are going to go well. So you've kind of got this like band of variance, right? Like your average is here and you've got variance on both sides of it. And the goal with Marvel Snap is to move that band upward, right? Now, you're still going to be moving within that the entire time, right? You're going to be bouncing, rubber banding back and forth throughout your band of variance, but people will focus on the peak of the band, right? So it'll be going and they'll say, this is 99, this is the peak. And then they'll fall back within that to like 97 and think, oh no, I'm going the wrong way. But you're not. Your band is still going up. You're still making progress. You're just riding that variance in between it, right? So eventually you're going to push the band up to where your average or even the low point will get past infinite. You're still going to climb as long as you're making progress. So you're not really losing progress or rank. That's just part of it. You're going to fall back. You're going to bounce up. So you just kind of have to keep advancing that range, that band, and you'll get there. So this is kind of philosophical shift almost, or just making people realize this, but I don't want you to get discouraged. I don't want you to feel bad. You're still climbing. So this is always a good reminder to greed and pride are bad. I see this so often in Marvel Snap, myself included, where I'm like, the opponent is emoting a bunch and I'm really prideful and I just want to beat them because they're emoting, or like they did something that annoyed me with a play, like, oh, they're Spider-Man, they're a leech, I'm going to beat them because they're a leech. And you have this sort of sense of pride in your games. But throw that away. That's garbage, right? Play what is statistically and logically sound. Don't let your emotions cloud your decision making when it comes to Marvel Snap. Who cares about that random person? If they're emoting you a bunch, they're an idiot anyway. Toss them aside. They're irrelevant to you. Your goal is not anything to interact with them. Your goal is progress on the ladder. So toss that aside. Same thing for greed, right? Sometimes we get greedy. We want big cube gains. We're like, oh, it's possible. Like, there's a chance. I've got a chance I could win this 8 cube game, Maybe if they don't have this, maybe if this play is sneaky enough. But sometimes you have to back up and say, wait a minute, am I just being greedy here, or is this actually logically sound? Or the numbers here, does this make sense? Am I favored to win this? And when you're not, you need to back out, right? So just being mindful of these emotions that can cloud our decision making can be really helpful. And then my final tip, this one's a good reminder too, is that bad luck goes both ways. I think very often in Marvel Snap, when we have something that's unfortunate, let's use Subterranea as an example. You say to yourself, oh my God, Subterranea sucks. I've got all these rocks. But remember, your opponent also has Subterranea. They might also have a lot of rocks. So even if you draw 2 rocks, there's a chance your opponent has drawn 4 rocks, right? Like, you have to be mindful that bad luck can go both ways. Now, you still have to be sensible. If you draw 4 rocks, it's unlikely that your opponent has drawn more rocks than you, right? So there's still some math to be done there with Subterranea sometimes. But I see so many people just get seemingly frustrated and instantly retreat. Perhaps a better example is like Lamentis 1. So many people will just instantly retreat when Lamentis 1 hits because their deck is destroyed. Now, obviously, sometimes that might be because they didn't hit a very specific sort of win condition, but the same logic applies. Your opponent also maybe didn't hit a specific win condition, right? So like, yeah, okay, you lost your win condition in Lamentis 1, but they might have as well. You don't need to retreat. Like, there's a chance. Play it out a little bit, especially if there's no snap happening. There's no risk of a higher stakes loss. Then just get a little more information. They might have been as unlucky or maybe even more unlucky than you. And I think people just throw away a lot of opportunity in the face of a frustration, particularly one that's often very symmetrical when they probably shouldn't. So there you go, guys. Those are my tips. I actually cut a few extra ones because they just didn't really, I don't know, they weren't sounding great. So I don't know if I ended up with 25 tips or not, but I don't know if I even promised 25 tips. Who knows? It's a PowerPoint presentation. Deal with it. But the final tip is right here behind me as a reminder. You can do this. I truly believe anybody, if they concentrate, focus, and learn, can hit infinite. And I don't even really think it'll be that hard for you if you do. It just takes some commitment, a little bit of advice, good deck here and there, and I think you've got a really good opportunity to hit infinite. So if nothing else, hopefully this video is a little bit of encouragement with some advice and tips and specifics. Sure, but just, you know, you got this. You can do it. Infinite is yours. So that said, I hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks much as always for watching. If you got questions in the comments, I'll try my best to answer a few here and there. Feel free to ask, but ultimately, you can do this. That said, thanks for watching, and until next time, game on.